Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is our last guest lecture in this series, in this sustainability series for this class. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bradley Hiller. Dr. Hiller is a sustainable development and climate change specialist. He has consulted to the World Bank Group, Asian Development Bank, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in the United Kingdom. He's an editorial board member and section editor of the journal Sustainability and was a visiting fellow at the Global Sustainability Institute in the United Kingdom. Dr. Hiller was a 2019 G20 Global Leadership Fellow at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management and a 2018 Asia Global Fellow at the University of Hong Kong. He has 2 postgraduate degrees from the University of Cambridge that we all love, and 2 undergraduate degrees from the University of Western Australia. Bradley is passionate about ecosystem conservation and restoration, synergies between low carbon resilient development and poverty alleviation, and emerging green financing models. So Dr. Hiller will be presenting, and his talk today is about the intersection of sustainable and low carbon resilient development. We have to pay attention that he's in Australia, so it's after midnight where he's from. So hopefully that the answers and the question QA session is not going to be too hectic for him at the end. So Dr. Hiller, thank you so much for coming today and talking to us in the class and to the faculty and the staff on via Zoom as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradley. The floor is all yours. The virtual floor is all yours, Dr. Bradley.
Thank you, Marwa. I hope you can hear me okay before I start. Yes, okay, excellent. Right, thanks everybody. Very glad to be here today, and thanks Marwa for inviting me. Thanks for the kind introduction, and I look forward to sharing some of my experiences and knowledge with you here today. So as Marwa said, the topic of the lecture will be called the intersection of sustainable development and low carbon resilient development, and I wanted to look at some concepts and case studies. So I think the idea of the lecture is that I'll speak for approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes at the end for questions, which I look forward to. Thank you. Okay, so the presentation outline today will be firstly starting with defining some concepts and setting the context, and then I'll go into 3 case studies, one which looks at geothermal energy systems based in Kenya, one that looks at landscape rehabilitation in the People's Republic of China, and finally, looking at how we pay for some of these initiatives through emerging sustainable finance initiatives. And also partway through, we'll look at the relevance of these systems to the United States as well. So if we start off with sustainable development, I'm sure you're all familiar with this term now on this course, but we'll just do some introductions here. There are different conceptual models to describe sustainable development. One that you may be familiar with is the overlapping circles model, where we have the components of economy, society, and environment, where sustainability exists in the center. We also have other models, which you may have seen, such as the 3-nested dependency model, where the economy sits within society, which itself sits within the broader environment. And we have the 3-legged stool model, again, which you may have already seen, but the concept here is that sustainable development cannot be achieved without integrating all 3 components. If all 3 legs on this stool are not considered or engaged in a process, then the stool itself does not stand up. In terms of the origins of sustainable development, you may be familiar again with our common future, the World Commission on Environment and Development, which was chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland. And in this report, they define sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. One part of this report, which is quite interesting and I think worth reflecting on today, is what they called the interlocking crises at the time. And if we draw on some text from here, we see that until recently, the planet was a large world in which human activities and their effects were neatly compartmentalized within nations, within sectors, and within broad areas of concern. These compartments have begun to dissolve. This applies in particular to the various global crises that have seized public concern, particularly over the past decade. These are not separate crises: an environmental crisis, a development crisis, an energy crisis. They are all one. And I think if we think today, this was written in 1987, which is over 30 years ago, many of these concepts still apply and are actually more relevant than ever, particularly in regard to the climate challenge. The policy directions of the report, again, it was written in 1987, included a lot of issues, again, which are relevant today, such as population, food security, ecosystems, energy, industry, and urban. But you'll notice that none of the policy directions in the report were explicitly focused on climate change, although global warming was referenced at the time. But if we look at this World Development Report, the Brundtland Report, we can see that some of the key takeaways include longer term considerations, or the concept of intergenerational equity, a whole of society approach or impacts, multi-sector and multi-stakeholder, and also aiming to create some sort of behavior change and transition. And again, I think if you look at this, despite being written so long ago, there are strong parallels with today's climate change challenge. So I want us to keep this in mind as we go through the lecture today. So if we look at low carbon resilient development, this is related to climate change. And again, I know you've had a lecture on climate change, so I won't go into too much detail here. But an overview here is that historically, we have seen changes in global temperature increases, sea level rises, and Arctic sea ice extent reductions. And we have seen also global emissions of carbon dioxide have increased quite dramatically, even since only 1990. And they've proceeded to grow quite quickly each decade since then. And many of you will be familiar with some of the potential impacts of climate change, which could include things such as increased incidence and severity of things such as wildfires, droughts, cyclones, or typhoons. As we look towards the future, we can see that it's likely that global temperature increases will reach or potentially exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. There's quite a bit of debate and some goals to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees by taking certain actions. But there's also acknowledgement that the increase in temperature may increase greater than 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. Now, whether it increases 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees may not sound like a lot, but if we look at this picture here on the right of the screen, we can see that this 0.5 degrees Celsius difference could be quite significant for many aspects of society, as you can see here, looking at the difference in extreme weather changes under 1.5 versus 2 degrees, as well as species, water availability, sea level rise, and various other impacts. So this, again, just to put into context that even though we may think that 0.5 degree Celsius is not much different, in terms of the impacts that it can have on different systems, it can be quite significant. If we look at outlook and actions, there are many aspects of climate change that will persist, given that the greenhouse gases are already in the atmosphere. That there is possibility to limit the increase in global mean temperature, and this is very important if we apply certain technological measures or changes in behaviour. However, this will require significant institutional technological change to avoid exceeding key thresholds, such as the 1.5 or 2 degree limit. There are two sort of general response actions that we can take as a society. The first here on the left are solar panels, and these could be an example of mitigation, which is defined as an anthropogenic intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. So that's human intervention to reduce sources, which would be an example of solar energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from coal or other fossil fuel-based sources. Or another one is to enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases, which could be changing vegetation structure or some other methods to sequester carbon. The second response action is adaptation, and this is defined as an adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. So the key here, I think, is the adjustment in natural or human systems. And you can see an example here on the right. This is a city where it's called green infrastructure or green space, which could be used, for example, to help manage increased floodwaters or something of a nature like that. And I'll go into these two response actions in a little bit more detail here. The global carbon cycle, this is an example here from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is the chief scientific body looking at these activities. And you can see here that there's natural fluxes in the carbon cycle, which are identified in the black arrows. But humans are having influence on this system, as indicated by the red arrows. And you can see here, we have global greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And it's quite clear that many of the emissions are coming from the energy sector. In this case, energy sector includes transport, but you can see over 70% coming from that sector through things such as industry, transport, and also use in buildings. Of note, the second largest sector is agriculture, forestry, and land use, followed by waste and also industry. So given this knowledge of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, how can we decarbonize? And you may have heard of different terminology here, but one way is what they call lowering emissions, which is generating greenhouse gases at a lower rate than business as usual. And this would involve, for example, switching from coal, which generates more emissions per unit of energy produced than gas, or switching from gas to solar or wind. So this is sort of a hierarchy of reductions. There's also what they call carbon neutral or net zero. And this can be achieved, two examples here, where you generate carbon dioxide in a short-term cycle, but there's no net increase in carbon dioxide. And an example of this would be bioenergy, where carbon dioxide is initially absorbed by organic material, such as a tree, but then could be released when that tree is, say, burnt to generate energy. So it sequesters the carbon, and then that carbon that is sequestered is then released when that is burnt. So that could be carbon neutral. Other cases would be where you generate carbon dioxide, but you capture and sequester it rather than releasing it to the atmosphere. And an example of this could be a coal-fired power station, which is fitted with something that we call carbon capture and storage. So you can see in the diagram, you have the coal-fired plant, and instead of the emissions going into the atmosphere, they're captured and stored underground. And then there's also what they call carbon negative, which is actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or sequestering more carbon dioxide than is emitted. The example we gave in the carbon neutral of bioenergy, so if you had a tree that sequesters carbon and then you burn that and the carbon is released to the atmosphere, if you sequestered that carbon and then you burnt the tree for energy use and you captured the emissions with carbon capture and storage or something of that nature, then that actually could be a carbon negative process. So you can see some examples where you could achieve carbon negativity through afforestation or reforestation activities. And the picture down the bottom right is conceptual, but this is what they call direct air capture. So could you actually remove greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide from the air itself? And this is technology that's currently being worked on. But I think at the moment, some integrated strategies may include a transition away from fossil fuel use, if possible, an improvement of efficiencies and the development of new technologies across a whole range of sectors, and then also biosequestration and carbon negative technologies to offset continuing or unavoidable emissions. And I know that many of you may have studies related to aircraft and things like this, and this could be an example of a sector where it could be difficult to reach carbon neutrality. So technologies to offset continuing or unavoidable emissions could be relevant in that sector. Adaptation or resilience building, as we mentioned before, this is an adjustment in natural or human systems in response to changes that are already taking place. And here are some examples from different sectors, some related to engineering, where you may have to increase water storage if there's changes in rainfall patterns. There's an example of a bridge on the right here, which is being raised due to perhaps increased flooding levels or increased flooding intensities. We see planting of drought-tolerant crops to cater for changing climatic conditions. And then also we see a conceptual picture here from New York City, where you have urban protection from storm surges and sea level rises through, again, what they call green infrastructure. There's a whole range of adaptation or resilience building activities that could be undertaken through three general categories: structural or physical, engineering, and built environment, and these could include seawalls and things like this. Technological, ecosystem-based is something that I'm quite interested in. Green infrastructure, ecological corridors, afforestation, services. Then we see social ways to build up adaptation capacities, and this could be educational, informational, behavioural. For example, it could be something such as an early warning and response system to notify farmers or others of changing conditions. And then we see institutional, economic laws and regulations, government policies and programs. And some of those could be related to engineering infrastructure and changing the standards that are associated with certain activities due to changing climate. So a question I think is relevant for the audience is, where do these two concepts intersect? We have sustainable development, which has been around sort of formally since 1987, and climate change, which is a particularly relevant issue today. Well, they're both relevant, but an increasingly relevant issue today. In terms of science or the theory, there are strong links between climate change and sustainable development. Sustainable development has many stressors that challenge the ability for it to be achieved. This could be poverty, this could be resource limitations, but climate change adds to the list of stresses to achieve ecological, economic and social objectives. So that's certainly related in that sense. And efforts to address climate change, both through adaptation and mitigation, which we've just discussed, will also inform and shape the global development agenda. So again, there's this interlinkage here between these two topics. We see that coping with the impacts of climate change and promoting sustainable development may share some common goals and determinants, including access to resources, and that's not just physical resources, but information technology, equity in the distribution of various resources, stocks of human and social capital, access to risk-sharing mechanisms, which are important for both of those topics, and abilities of decision support mechanisms to cope with degrees of uncertainty. Nonetheless, there may be some trade-offs that need to be struck between climate change and sustainable development on occasion. And you remember at the beginning, we looked at this nested dependencies model as one way to look at sustainable development, which is down at the bottom there. But you can also see up the top, if you Similarly, for sustainable development, if you only look at economy, you're ignoring society and environment. But if you're only looking at mitigation, for example, and you're ignoring other sustainable development issues, then this is also not a holistic or integrated way of looking at things. So I think, again, there's quite a few similarities in some of the challenges that we face here. In terms of at the international level, there are intersections between climate change and sustainable development. The first one are the Sustainable Development Goals, which many people have probably heard of. And Sustainable Development Goal 13 is related to climate action. And this relates to strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to hazards and natural disasters, which are related to climate change. Integrating climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. Improving education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity. Mobilizing significant funding to address the needs of developing countries, and operationalizing something called the Green Climate Fund, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And raising the capacity for effective climate change related planning and management in least developed countries, and including engagement with women, youth, and local and marginalized communities. So again, this is focused on sustainable development goals, but does include as one of those climate action. And even though it's a single goal here, it does influence many of the other goals. For example, looking at hunger or food production related to climate change, life on land is related to climate change, life on water, many other, and affordable and clean energy. So there's very strong linkages here. In this international intersections part 2, you may have heard of the Paris Agreement. This is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by many countries in 2015 and was regarded as a large success. You can see in the map at the right there that most countries have signed the agreement, almost all countries have signed the agreement and many have joined the agreement. So this is very important. So it's basically saying that most countries agree with the idea that climate change is posing a threat and actions need to be taken. The Paris Agreement, I mentioned before the 2 degree and 1.5 degrees Celsius numbers. One of the goals of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And in some ways, countries need to look to peak their greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to achieve some of those terminologies that we referred to in some of the previous slides. A third one, which you may or may not have heard about, is called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which runs from 2015 to 2030. And this outlines clear targets and priorities for action to prevent new and also reduce existing disaster risks by understanding disaster risk, strengthening governance to manage risk, investing in disaster reduction for resilience, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and building back better. If we come from the international level to the national and local level, we can see that some of these higher level SDGs and Paris Agreement do culminate in actions at national level or local. For example, in sustainable development, there are things called voluntary national reviews, which help to track progress and implementation. An example here, this is related to the Paris Agreement. This is what they call a nationally determined contribution, or an NDC. And this is where, from the Paris Agreement, which countries may have signed or ratified at a high level, then work out how they will go about to achieve their mitigation actions to reduce their emissions and also their adaptation actions. This is something that provides indicators of what the country wants to do and how they want to achieve it, by when. We see that the US has recently announced plans for its own NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution, and a whole of government climate action. to help implement the Paris Agreement targets. And you can see here on the left, we have examples from at the city level of an initiative called the C4 Cities Initiative, and also resilience building of cities under the Sendai framework. So I think hopefully this provides an idea from what's happening at the international level to national level, and then how it may be implemented in cities or regions around you. In terms of financing, all these things need to be paid for. And as Marwa mentioned, some of my work is in the development sector. So I'll share some examples here. Many of the major development banks, from the Inter-American Development Bank on the left here, they have an initiative called NDC Invest. Again, NDC is the nationally determined contributions. So how can these development banks help their member countries, which are usually developing or emerging countries, to implement their climate goals and provide technical support and access to finance. So the Inter-American Development Bank has what they call NDC Invest. The World Bank has something called the NDC Support Facility. The Asian Development Bank has something called NDC Advance. And then the African Development Bank has what they call the Africa NDC Hub. So these are initiatives which are especially provide special support to client countries. And as I mentioned before, other financing organizations such as the Green Climate Fund, which has been established to help implement some of the Paris Agreement objectives. The Adaptation Fund, again, we spoke about the difference between mitigation and adaptation. And then we have the Global Environment Facility, which has been working to finance and support environmentally focused projects for quite a few years. These are just a small amount of examples from the public international sector. Obviously, the private sector plays an important role through direct financing or corporate social responsibility and these sorts of things. But these are some examples here that come from my work. Okay, so there's a bit of an overview of sustainable development and low carbon